Okay, so it's 11 o'clock, and I think we should start. So, welcome to everyone, and I think people are going to be joining as we go along. But this is our first in a series of ICSVE talks, which will be happening during our lockdown when we're all at home. And we're going to be talking about various issues of terrorism and violent extremism every 2 weeks. So today's our first one. Then in 2 weeks on June 10th, we'll have a group of prison imams and workers who are going to try to answer the question of, can an ISIS terrorist be successfully rehabilitated and reintegrated into society? And all of them have worked successfully on terrorism charged cases and are also working with ISIS returnees. So I think that will be a really interesting panel as well. Then on June 24th, we have now retired Ambassador Peter Galbraith, who is with us also today, and he's agreed to share about his work in SDF territory, addressing the women and children in particular, and to talk about a case where he was involved with bringing the children and their mother back to a European country from SDF detention. And it also is a successful repatriation. So that should be interesting. And we'll keep going this way every 2 weeks until we're not locked down anymore and we can travel. And at least Anthony and I are going stir crazy because we're used to traveling a lot. And we'll be trying to share our knowledge of what we've gained from our travels. So today we have, hi there. And I keep seeing people as they're joining. Hi, Vladimir. I think you're muted, so you can't talk, but sorry. Okay, today we have 265 participants signed up, which really impressed me. And I hear from many that they shared the link without registering throughout their offices, so we may have even more. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we're honored by your presence. Some of the people joining us today are really high level, and that's amazing that you're joining us. Eid Mubarak to our Muslim colleagues. And I also want to thank our staff, Zach Badorf, who makes all of our, or most of our videos, is running the techie side of things, and he'll try to unmute people when it's time for question and answer. We also have many of our staff tuning in from the USA, Iraq, Canada, Sweden, Belgium, and that includes Molly Ellenberg, Claire Worcester, Nima Azadi, Haider Shigati, Sheikh Ali, Othman Mohammed from Australia, Tanuba Akbar, Gabriel Fodor from Sweden, and we have our partners Musa Hassan Al-Diao and Hassan Susan, who are partners in Belgium and Austria, tuning in. And I'd like to credit them all because it's not me that does this work, it's all of us. And then I want to thank our sponsors. We've been at ICSVE supported by the State Department, by UN Women, the European Union, Facebook, private donors, and the state of Qatar. And we're grateful to all of our sponsors for bringing us this far, but we're particularly grateful to Qatar because they put our project, the Breaking the ISIS Brand Counter-Narrative Project, which we started with the State Department support, on steroids. Originally back in 2016 with State Department support, we had made 32 in-depth interviews of ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners, and we now have made 239. And I find that quite amazing. Sometimes I pinch myself. And with the addition of our research fellow, Molly Ellenberg, we've now coded all that data. So we've gone through all the soft data and coded them on 346 variables, and we've written them up. You can read that. You can go to our website if you want. And one of the things that came out when we coded the data is we found that 30% of the sample had been recruited, approximately 30%, had been recruited online or by online exposure alone. That was enough to prompt them into traveling to Syria. So that tells you something, that the spread of these ideas has been happening for a long time, and also that internet, as we see right now today, is an intimate medium where we can forge relationships that may move us into action. And that's particularly important right now when kids are vulnerable at home, on the internet for hours, bored, And some of them may be moved into action by groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Shabaab, because we know that ISIS has a strong track record of convincing vulnerables into self-destructive action. In addition to all of our interviews, we have created with Sheikh Ali and with Zach Badorf 180 short video clips of these ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners when they're willing to speak against ISIS, telling their story first and then saying, don't join, it was a mistake, I really regret it, don't be fooled by their lies, that kind of thing. And you can view those if you want to go on ISIS Fest. You can go and listen to all 180 of them and watch them. They're on our ICSVE YouTube channel. Likewise, we're very grateful to Facebook, because Facebook has partnered with us and allowed us to carry out already 150 campaigns. We subtitle all our videos in 27 different languages, and we campaign with them all over the world. And we're really proud about all the people that we reach with these counter narratives. And we study the results of it, of course. And we've also created the Real Jihad website, a landing page from Facebook, so that we can watch and see, do they go to the Real Jihad website? And we're working on building that out to be a real resource, so that if someone gets their idea of joining ISIS shaken, they might read more, watch more, and decide differently, hopefully. Today we're going to be talking about repatriations, and this is a topic that's very important to me, as we've been working at ICSVE primarily with European countries. When I first went into SDF territory, I worked in Camp Rouge first for interviews, and I saw one woman that was about to give birth to her child. She was 7 months pregnant. She had had a C-section, and she was going to give vaginal birth, which is a high-risk birth. I saw a mother with a child that was asthmatic and had almost died a couple of times. And the air quality is bad in Camp Rouge, and medications are hard to get. She said, I'm willing to send my kid home without me. So immediately I started asking, does your country know you're here? Have you had any relationship with your justice ministry? Would you like me to send your notes to your justice ministry? And this has now evolved that we've worked quite closely with the Germans. We've done 31 cases where the detainees said, please send my notes home. I'm willing to be prosecuted. I would like to be prosecuted. I would like to go home. And the Germans on their side say, the politicians make the decision, but we have to be ready, and this really helps us to be ready and to go case by case and figure out, okay, this one, not only can we prosecute, but we feel comfortable with the repatriation. So these are really important issues. We have to find solutions to them. COVID is spreading throughout Syria as it's spreading throughout the world. There's children in the camps. They were born and brought into ISIS, not at their own will. And there's a lot of legal and moral issues that we need to consider. Let's see. Just looking at my notes to make sure that I've said everything that I want to say. Oh, I'd like to say, I find there's always blessings in adversity, and we were sorry that we couldn't gather in person, because with Qatar we've been very blessed that they've funded security salon nights and great luncheons where we've had speakers. So we're not serving a meal today, sorry about that, but we're really happy that we could get so many people from all over the world to join, in a much bigger group than we normally would have, because when it's a meal we have to limit it. So we're happy for that, and excited to see what happens with online interactions. And so now I'm going to move to our topic and to our speakers. Tasneem Akunji is an attorney for Shamima Begum's family, and Anthony Lloyd is a senior journalist and correspondent for The Times. He's the journalist who found Shamima in Camp Hole after she surrendered during the time of the Battle of Baghuz. Shamima was 15 when she left home, and she was 19 when she was found in Camp Hole. Many felt sympathy for her when they saw the picture that we used on our promotional materials, when they saw her going through Istanbul airport, looking like a teenager on an adventure, which I think is what she believed she was on. And she probably thought she was joining an Islamic utopia, but public opinion quickly shifted in her case. And that's something that Anthony is going to address. And Shamima's case, while we're going to focus on it somewhat today, it's representative of many of the women and their children who were born or brought into ISIS. They become the subject of great debate over Westerners who went to join ISIS and whose countries now refuse to take them and their children home. They live in illegal limbo in SDF detention camps, while COVID and also the political realities of the SDF, with Turkey invading last fall and Syria possibly taking over the camps at some point, loom on the horizon. So we'll start first. The way we're going to work today is Anthony will speak first, and then Tasneem will speak, and then we'll open it to questions. And we'll see how it works to try to unmute people to ask their questions. Otherwise, we will just field them from chat. And Molly is also looking at our ICSVE Twitter, and she'll add those to chat as well. But to introduce Anthony, a senior journalist and war correspondent for the Times. He began reporting for the Times during the Bosnian War in 1993 and has reported from many of the major conflict zones. He's a fearless man. He's been in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Maybe I shouldn't say fearless, but he overcomes his fear. And he's been recognized for 10 major press awards, including from Amnesty International for his work in Syria in 2012 and 2014. And he's written 2 critically acclaimed books. Anthony wrote about discovering Shamima and all the controversy that ensued, and I think he will speak a bit about that. And I'll introduce Tasneem after Anthony speaks. So the floor is yours, Anthony. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks for such a generous introduction. So just to recap for everybody, I'm a British journalist at the Times. I've been a journalist for 27 years now, and I've worked mostly in wars, but I started working in Syria in 2012. During those 27 years, I can quite safely say that Shamima Begum's story has been one of the most toxic and complicated, probably the most toxic and complicated that I've ever had to work upon. And also one of the most important. It encapsulates a whole range and raft of issues: statehood, citizenship, radicalism, de-radicalization, emotion, political opportunism, the threat of terrorism, and not forgetting the power of journalism and the limitations of journalism too. All of these issues are tied up in the case of a girl who ran away from school aged 15, and then I found her, by which time she was 19 after 4 years living in the Caliphate. So I'm going to talk now about how I found her, just the background of it, so you're aware of how that occurred, what she said to me, how I interpreted it, and what happened next as a way to bring out these issues. I found Shamima on the 13th of February last year. I had gone to Syria at the end of January, just a few weeks before. And this was something I did very regularly. The reason I went then was because Islamic State was fighting to defend its last slither of its kind of territorial integrity at a place called Baghouz, which was in the mid-Euphrates Valley. And the Kurdish-led SDF were the coalition's main allies there, the ground force as it were, and they'd got Baghouz encircled and were going to overrun it. The fighting went on for weeks, may I add. But Baghouz in itself was a crucible which contained, amongst the kind of most hardcore diehards of Islamic State, and a whole lot of people who couldn't escape too, and thousands of wives and children. And I figured that Shamima's case was already very well known in the UK when within weeks, or within a week, I think, of her running away from the UK. The Metropolitan Police had advised her parents to go public, or her family to go public with it, as a way of highlighting her case in the hope that they might be able to get her back. She fled with two other schoolgirls, Khadija Sultana and Amira Basir. So her story was already an extremely high-profile story within the UK, because it was emblematic of the thrall that Islamic State had over teens. I mean, these were three intelligent girls doing well at school and left overnight. And the next thing, you know, they crossed through Turkey and entered Syria. So it was already a high-profile story. And I figured that as Baghouz was likely to be overrun, it was possible that some of the Bethnal Green girls, as they were known, might have survived and might have escaped. So my logical port of call, I spent a couple of weeks reporting on the battle and traveling around the area. But I put in for permission to visit Al Hol camp. Al Hol camp had been set up originally for refugees displaced in Iraq. But in the weeks of the Baghouz battle, it had been taking families, ISIS families and children from Baghouz. By the time I went there were about 40,000 people. The numbers increased by another 25,000, 30,000 on top of that. When I asked, I got my permission, I went there, I met the camp authorities. They absolutely had no idea who they'd got in their camp. There was no nominal role at the time for new arrivals. They weren't sure exactly whether they had any Brits or not. And so my request to see any of the Bethnal Green girls fell on deaf ears. And they were saying, indeed, they were saying they didn't have any Brits. They were joking with me. They were like, you know, over the course of 2 hours, we got French here, we got Chinese here. Hey, you can meet some Brazilians, but we haven't got any Brits. And eventually one of these guys, one of the administrators, sort of threw up his hands in exasperation and said, I'll go into the area for new arrivals and I'll find two or three foreign women you can speak to. He came back 20 minutes later with two veiled women. I sat down in the small office, the administrative office with these women for the camp. First woman started speaking to me. She was Canadian, obviously veiled. She had two young children with her, two little boys. Excuse me. And then the second woman started speaking. The first thing she said, I'm a sister from London. I'm a Bethnal Green girl. At that moment, I wanted to sort of take control of the environment of the interview a bit, realizing that this was important. So I asked if we could continue the conversation in privacy in the yard, which was what happened next. The yard was quite a big yard. We sat in a slither of shadow. This was late morning, and spoke for about 90 minutes. And about the first hour, slightly less than the first hour, was spent, first of all, trying to calm her down. She was quite agitated. It was Shamima Begum. And secondly, just talking through actually what her story was, what had happened to her. She didn't want to be taped or photographed initially, but then after about, as I say, about an hour, about an hour, she did allow for the interview to be taped. So I ended up with about 25 minutes of tape. Now, first of all, what did she say to me, and how did I see that, both as a journalist and someone who had, you know, quite a lot of experience over the years speaking to jihadi wives of women who are described as those who also wanted to live within the caliphate rather than necessarily as jihadi wives or just jihadis in general. First of all, I've described why I wanted to speak to her, but I'll tell you the reason why she wanted to speak to me when she found there was a journalist there. Primarily, over and above everything else, she wanted to save the life of her unborn child. She was 9 months pregnant. She had recently lost two infant children over the period of the preceding 5 months. She had lost an infant son and an infant daughter. She was 9 months pregnant, soon to give birth. She did not want to lose her third child. At that, I remain certain that was her prime driving influence for wanting to speak to a journalist. She said to me, after my two other kids died, I'm just really overprotective of this baby. I'm scared that this baby is going to get sick in this camp. That's why I really want to get back to Britain, because I know it will get taken care of, health-wise at least. There are other reasons for wanting to go back to Britain too, but her prime reason for speaking to me was to highlight her presence in the camp in the hope she could go home and that her child would not die. One other thing I would say, and people can agree or disagree with me how they wish, but this is how I saw it in the first conversation she had with a journalist, which I don't think was contrived. Lastly, the more conversations she had with people, then different agendas started cropping up, both amongst questioners and perhaps in her own attitude too. But I would say she was, and I'd say you've got to be clear-eyed about this, I would say she was radicalized, and pretty obviously so. I have some caveats to that. Check out some of the things she said to me. Now, she knows she's speaking to a journalist. First of all, she describes seeing the severed head in the bin in Raqqa. It's one severed head she talks about. She describes being unfazed at seeing it. She says she has no regrets at being part of the caliphate and suggested that journalists, Western journalists executed by ISIS, had been spying. Now, looking at these in a cold way, the severed head discussion we had was revealing, as to my mind, it was symptomatic of the binary mentality, the kind of either-or mindset that you often find with jihadis. She'd seen one head in the bin. She said it had belonged to a prisoner, a male prisoner. And when I asked her how she could condone it, she just said, well, look, what would he have done to me as a Muslim woman if he hadn't been beheaded? I mean, she just saw him as a threat. There was no question that, oh, he was a prisoner and you shouldn't do that to prisoners. She just saw it through the prism of being a threat. As for the issue of the beheading of journalists, I said, well, how do you feel about that? She said, well, surely there was a security threat. They could have been spying, which was quite a remarkable comment to actually make to the journalist. They were totally unsurprising remarks to me, may I add. I mean, they were exactly what I would have expected from somebody I was interviewing, who I'd interviewed schools already, fresh from the caliphate. They showed the effect of what kettling, of 4 years kettling within the caliphate would have had on a teenager's mind. However, she did also portray many traits of individual thought and criticism of the caliphate. She said Islamic State didn't deserve victory due to their oppression of their own people. She was still really angry about the imprisonment and torture of her husband, who was an Islamic State fighter, had been an Islamic State fighter, by Islamic State. He had been charged for spying in one of their internal fracas and been imprisoned for a long time and tortured. And she was very critical of Islamic State. So overall, she was a paradox. I found her a contradictory figure. Nothing she said particularly surprised me. On the one hand, she showed traits of having been radicalized. On the other hand, she showed traits of a lot of individual thought. What happened next? I drove away from the camp early afternoon. I wrote the story that afternoon. It appeared in the paper the next day, the Times the next day, under the headline, "Bring Me Home." Just before most people would have read that story, I've been interviewed by the BBC, by Radio 4 on the Today programme, and by Nick Robinson at length. And I'd argued then, as I'd argued in the piece, and I've always argued since, that the circumstances of her case are particularly complex. She should be brought home, investigated, if necessary, go to prison, or rehabilitated back to our society. I thought when my story was out that there will be anger within the UK around her case, but I also thought she would be brought home and that common sense would prevail. But that wasn't what happened. Within 5 days of that story, my story appearing, she'd had her citizenship revoked by the then Home Secretary Sajid Javid. By and large, the reaction was one of rage within the UK, not exclusively, but by and large. And 2 weeks later, the photograph I had taken of her, with her consent that I had, which had been used as a front page photograph of the Times, was being used as a target imprint for a gun club in the Wirral so that people could pay to pump it full of holes. Less than 4 weeks later, even worse happened when on the 8th of March, the child, the little boy who she'd given birth to after I interviewed her, got a respiratory sickness and died in the camp. She'd been moved from Al-Hol camp to Al-Roj camp by then. So the young teenager is pregnant who'd come to me, joined the caliphate, came to me wanting primarily to save the life of her child, was left with absolutely nothing. Chronologically, I'll just go very quickly through immediately what happened after that. There were two sets of allegations which came out that April, both of them very hard to, or perhaps impossible to verify, and both highly questionable. The first was from a guy using an alias from a collective of activists, Syrian activists, who suggested that Shamima Begum had been a member of Al-Hisba, Islamic State's morality police, and described her walking around in red shoes, ordering people to adhere to the correct dress rules. The claim was never substantiated. It was slightly odd because she didn't speak Arabic and he hadn't said what language she was speaking to people in, nor if she was wearing red shoes but veiled, how he knew it was Shamima Begum. The other was more damaging, was from British intelligence service sources who said that there were alleged unsubstantiated reports that she had been involved sewing suicide bombers into their belts so that they couldn't be, the belts couldn't be easily removed. Again, these were unsubstantiated, and those sources did say they were, even when they leaked these claims to the press, that they were unsubstantiated. Last summer, the Metropolitan Police applied for a ruling to order me to hand over all the notes I had from my interviews to them, and they lost that case at the Old Bailey. Shamima Begum, in turn, appealed against the revocation of her citizenship and lost the first round of that appeal in February this year. That was how it was. Just a couple of other points I want to make. I've always believed that there was every reason to repatriate, investigate, and if possible, rehabilitate Shamima Begum. I don't think it would be very difficult. I think, having said that she was radicalized, I've had 2 subsequent meetings with her since, spoken to a lot of other people who know her. I think she's fallen fast from the thrall of Islamic State. From a practical point of view, in terms of security, Britain's decision to strip her of her citizenship, I would regard as one of political opportunism and indeed hypocrisy, because it's a reversal of what's been going on in private. Since 2012, the UK has allowed 400 members either of Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra, latterly known as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, back into the UK. The predominant grouping within that has been of male fighters. So the Home Secretary's decision to revoke citizenship of a young woman from Bethnal Green, who had gone there as a minor, aged 15 years old, flies very much in the face of what had been going on as a policy in private until that point. Moreover, 2 other simple things. If you kettle thousands, it's a good word, kettle, thousands of foreign fighters and their family members together without a long-term solution in probably one of the least stable parts of the world, that is no solution at all. It's just kicking the can along down a crisis road. And it could have cataclysmic consequences at the end of the day. Nor, lastly, but importantly, what I add is very fair to the Syrian Kurds, the coalition's main ally in the ground war against Islamic State. The caliphate as an entity wanted to in northern Syria, and yet it is the Kurds, who shed far more blood than we did fighting Islamic State, who have ended up having to carry the can in guarding and putting in camps people who they never wanted in their country in the first place, who were an existential threat to them. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. And maybe before we move to Tasneem, all 3 of us have been there to Camp Rouge, and well, I guess you interviewed her in Camp Hole, which is even worse. But Jack Straw said when her baby was born, and I also wrote a letter to ask that the baby be taken immediately back to the UK, because the baby had no fault of being born into ISIS. And his public statement was that it's too dangerous to send a diplomat to go and retrieve the baby. And on Twitter, I volunteered, and I keep repeating that I'll bring any child that European countries can be repatriated, because I'm not afraid. Well, now with COVID, it's a little bit more complicated. But all 3 of us have been there, and maybe Tasneem, you can talk about that a little bit in yours. speaking as well, but it was completely possible to carry a baby out of there, wasn't it, Anthony?
I could have been. I mean, it was. I wouldn't say the circumstances were benign, but they were as near to benign as they could have been. I mean, the
Okay,
Kurdish sector was very well controlled. There was no reason to have prevented an NGO or a medical NGO or even the Red Cross from or Red Crescent from
or a soldier,
driving them to the border over the period of particularly from Al Roj camp. It could have been over the border within 20 minutes.
Okay, I'm seeing Ambassador Galbraith agitated because he did just this, but we're going to hear about that on the 24th. Okay, now thank you, Anthony. That was very good, and I'm sure people have lots of questions, as I myself do. But next we're going to hear from Tasneem Akuji. Sorry, I'm tripping over your name just because I'm nervous. And he's the attorney for Shamima Begum's family. He has also traveled to SDF territory, had his own adventure. In doing that, he was briefly detained and told that he could not see his client. He is now representing the family, and he's been fighting the case of Shamima's repatriation to the UK. And he's here to discuss the moral and the legal issues regarding a minor who was groomed and joined a terrorist group or went to live with a terrorist group. I don't think the women in general gave their bayat. And the issues of detaining an individual without charges, stripping citizenship, and the cruelties involved in not bringing her infant back to the UK for life-saving medical care. So the floor is yours now, Tasneem, and I look forward to hearing from you as well.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, I'll start with what you've just said, actually, in terms of British officials saying that it was too dangerous for them to send people out to the camps to bring a small child back. Now, we, as Shamima Begum's family's legal team, we wrote to Sajid Javid and the British government as soon as the child was born to say, we don't need your help, really, in bringing that child back. We were fully confident that we could do that privately. All we wanted was for them not to stand in the way of that, really. So for us to be able to apply for documentation for the child, because at that time the child was a British citizen by birth. The child was the child of Shamima Begum. She hadn't been stripped of citizenship at that point, and so the child was British, and we were quite willing to go and bring that child back. And instead we got this statement from Ben Wallace, exactly in line with what you were told, which was that they weren't willing to provide or put officials' lives at risk. Now, this was at a time where a number of British journalists had managed to go to Shamima Begum and sort of myself, really, with no real problems. So it was a complete nonsense that that was not a possibility. And that letter was published in the press, and it sits there on the record to say we didn't even need their assistance. We just wanted them to follow proper procedure, which is where a citizen applies for documentation that would be provided, and then we can go and do the very simple task of bringing that child back. And so from a moral standpoint, the thing that's motivated me beyond where I was motivated already was that I find that cabal of the British government responsible for the death of a child, really, manslaughter by inaction. But the story of Shamima Begum and my involvement with that goes back all the way to February 2015, where these three girls had gone. There was another girl whose name is Shamina Begum, and she was from the same school in North London, and she was the first one to strike out, to go in December 2014 over to Syria. She was part of the friendship circle of the three later who went in February. When those girls had gone, the three in February, their family members got in contact with me because the relationship between them and the police had started to break down, and they needed legal help because there were real difficulties with UK law. For example, if your daughters, as theirs had, found themselves in Syria, is it legal for you to send them money in order to bring them back, really? And the answer is no. Under UK law, that would be seen as terrorist financing and you'd be guilty of an offence. And so this particular problem of families wanting to help their children come back home, or what they could do around that, is something that is fraught with legal difficulties. So the British police had encouraged the families to go out on television and to encourage their daughters to come back. By then, the kids had already managed to get to the border between Syria and Turkey and were probably over the border at that point anyway. And so our role with them then developed in one from just advising to a slightly different role, which was to try and put operational matters together to try and retrieve those kids, really. Not the usual work that we do, but a lot of people came out of the woodwork who were very helpful, particularly a Belgian individual who had successfully managed to go into ISIS territory and bring children back. And during the currency of this plan to get them back, other families had approached us, and we'd managed to successfully bring back other women who had been detained by ISIS. So we knew that there was a route out. And the really important part of this was that that plan was communicated to the UK authorities. We were in contact with the UK police, we were in contact with the UK officials and the security services, and we were telling them our plan is to, as legally viable as it is, to go in through Turkey, get to the border of Syria, and get them back by hook or by crook, really. And in fairness to the officials and the authorities at the time, they did not stand in our way. They were fully aware of what our plan was. They were fully aware of the execution of our plan to bring other women back, which we successfully did. And so if there was an issue with respect to the security threat of these small children, these girls at the time, then surely the Home Secretaries of the day would have stripped them of citizenship at the time, because we had been providing the authorities with our knowledge of where they were in Raqqa at that time, really. And in any event, this matter was heard in Parliament. Issues were asked around it, particularly around the failings of the police to prevent those girls from going in the first place, given that they had many months' notice of a girl who'd gone in December. And the UK police accepted their failings and they apologised for them. And they also gave a very important statement where they said that these girls, should they return, they would be treated as victims and not terrorists, as long as there was no evidence of them committing any further crimes, really. And to date, we've had no evidence of them committing any other crimes, save for joining a prescribed organisation, really. So we fast forward on to Anthony's interaction with Shamima Begum, and the fact that the Home Secretary then strips her of her citizenship. Now, under the UK law, we have a piece of legislation that's been very little used until recently, which is called the British Nationality Act of 1981. And there's a section within that that allows a Home Secretary to strip somebody of citizenship on a number of conditions. And the main condition is that they'd have to assess that they were not conducive to the public good. So that's a very, widely defined phrase. One could argue that farting in a lift is not conducive to the public good, really, particularly if you're in the lift. But that phrase hasn't been defined very, very narrowly. And so that gives almost carte blanche for a Home Secretary to remove citizenship with that particular test in mind. But there is a caveat to that. And that caveat is that that person cannot be made stateless as a result of that stripping. Now, in Shamima Begum's case, the Home Secretary argues that because her parents hail from Bangladesh and her father is a Bangladeshi resident, that at the time where he decided to strip her citizenship, that she was a national of Bangladesh at that moment in time. And that is a bone of contention. So the Bangladeshi authorities very quickly sent out a statement to say that they did not consider Shamima Begum being a citizen or ever having been a citizen of Bangladesh. She'd never been to Bangladesh. She didn't have a Bangladeshi passport. And crucially, she didn't apply for Bangladeshi citizenship, or certainly her parents hadn't applied on her behalf. And their reasoning is, according to their law, that an individual can apply for Bangladeshi citizenship, but it's the decision of the state as to whether they grant it or not, really. And so even though there's an operation of the state that usually does grant these things, in her particular case, given that she was, she'd spent some time in ISIS territory and it was well known, that in her case that they would have certainly, had she applied, they wouldn't have granted any sort of citizenship at all. The UK government say, well, no, the operation of Bangladeshi law is that if an individual is less than 21 years old and they have parents who are Bangladeshi, then they are automatically a Bangladeshi citizen. Now, this is an issue of fact around Bangladeshi law, which is being litigated on. The current judgment has fallen on the side of, unsurprisingly, the government's experts on it, whose interpretation of Bangladeshi law is that it's an automatic right. And the Bangladeshi, our expert on the Bangladeshi side, his position is, well, actually, no, it is a discretion of the Bangladeshi government as to whether they would have at the time granted her citizenship. And so she didn't have an automatic right to Bangladeshi citizenship, and that would be subject to further appeal, really. Beyond that, there were a couple of other arguments that have been levied, and one is that the decision to deny Shamima Begum her citizenship has led to the result that she, her rights, European Convention on Human Rights, Article 2 and 3, the right to life and the right to be protected from cruel and inhumane treatment, they were affected because it led to her continued stay in conditions that present in Al Hol and then Al Roj. And it was accepted by the court that the conditions of Roj and Al Hol would be in breach of Article 2 and 3. However, the reasoning of the court at the moment has been that just because somebody's rights could be breached doesn't mean that the decision itself was unlawful. That requires a test of the merits of whether or not that effect of them staying in those conditions is outweighed by their threat to national security. And that's something the court, or this court, hasn't considered, because in these type of cases, you have a very interesting scenario where you have what's known as open evidence and closed evidence. So at the moment, we're dealing with the open evidence, which is that which is in the public domain or can be allowed in the public domain. There is now also a section of these proceedings that are closed evidence, which means that us, the open lawyers, will not see it, and Shamima Begum will not see the evidence against her. But there are closed lawyers or security cleared lawyers who will see the evidence, but they can't tell us, the open lawyers, what that evidence is, really. So they're sort of in a legal where they get to see it all, and they can't tell us what they see, but we can tell them information. The problem is we can't tell them information that's tailored to anything they have because we don't know what they have. But the long and the short of it is that element of the proceedings haven't taken place, and so that balancing between whether or not her threat to national security versus her Article 3, Article 2 rights were proportionally affected. And then the final argument that was deployed at the moment was whether or not she, if I could check that, the fact that she can't have an effective appeal is in itself a reason why the decision is bad. And what I mean by that is Shamima Begum is held in a condition where she doesn't have access to lawyers directly. Any communication she has with lawyers is not done in any sort of closed or controlled way. So we don't know who's listening into that, or whether indeed she's able to communicate with us without somebody else being in the room. We don't know who that is. So we can't have privileged communications with her. And because of that, and because of effectively what her inability to have free communications with her lawyers, then the fact of that means that the appeal itself cannot be effective, really. And it's been accepted in other scenarios to do with immigration cases that where there is an ineffective appeal, by definition, the decision must be wrong, and therefore the person must either be brought back to the UK in order to give oral evidence, or the decision is simply wrong and the person's nationality is then reinstated effectively. But in this case, the court isn't looking at it that way, or this initial decision isn't looking at it that way. They're accepting that she has no ability to have an effective appeal, but they're saying that that does not, by definition, mean that the process itself it has been misapplied. Again, that will lead to a merits test where evidence has to be brought either way about what the effect of her inability to communicate will be to the overall proceedings and whether or not the threat to national security outweighs that, really. So that decision is now in the middle of an appeal and will have a hearing, and these arguments will be fleshed out in due course.
All right, great. Thank you. The chat is full of questions, and Zach is going to try to unmute people one by one so they can ask their questions and probably make their comments because people have some very astute comments as well. So let's do 4 or 5 questions, and then Anthony and Tasneem, you can respond as you like. I thought maybe we would let Ambassador Peter Galbraith make the first question comment. You're unmuted, so go for it.
Thank you, and thank you for such interesting presentations and for the work you've done. Anthony, I have to say, interviewing some of the male British fighters, or British male detainees, I should say, because they insisted they weren't fighting, in February of 2019, they made almost exactly the same comments as Shamina did about the journalists who were beheaded and about the being spies. It was very kind of an interesting position. My question is, we talk a lot about individual cases, but or 2 questions. First, what is the well, maybe 5,000 children, 3,000 women, never mind the several thousand men. At the rate at which cases are being resolved, this is hundreds of years. So I wonder, what thoughts any of you might have about the larger picture, particularly that of the children. And second, what your sense is about the resources that are available to the Kurds. I have to say, they've been extraordinary. They've devoted extraordinary resources to this, given that they have a large number of displaced people, both who suffered at the hands of ISIS and at the hands of Turkey last October and November. I just got a message from a woman in Roj camp, a picture of her daughter, who's 3. The Kurds gave all the little girls new dresses. They brought sweets and gifts to all the people in Roj, probably the same in Al-Hol. But at the same time, if you've been there, as you have been, you know that there's an inadequate force guarding the place. Large numbers of the most radical women get smuggled out. The radical women certainly are in charge of Al-Hol. In fact, when Bernard Kouchner and I were there in September, they said, "Oh, it's really too dangerous for you to go in an armored vehicle into the foreign part of Al-Hol. In Roj, we could walk around with armed guards." So, what about the obligation of governments to come up with adequate resources to ensure that these detention camps are adequately run, adequately protected, which really goes to the safety of the detainees?
It's good questions and good comments. Let's just do 2 more, and then we'll let Anthony and Tasneem speak again. So we have Wahid Azam Noor, the Assistant Police Commissioner from the Bangladesh Police. If you can unmute him, Zach, and let him make his comment and his question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me in this. And I have been very curious over this case, Shamima Begum case, and I have been following this case for more than a year. I am also in regular contact with her parents. So my comment is, okay, I'm not talking as a government official here. So I'm talking as a researcher and an interested person in this field. So Bangladesh government has denied that Shamima Begum is the citizen of Bangladesh, but I that is partially true, but I think that Shamima Begum is a citizen of Bangladesh according to the law of our country. And when I talked with her father, he did not seem at all interested to take her daughter back to Bangladesh. And he told me that he consulted with the lawyers, I don't know who, but they advised him uh, to not to push for that. I mean, to claim the citizenship of Bangladesh. So that according to our law, actually, she is a citizen of Bangladesh by descent. So the only way you can strip this citizenship, I should mention first that in our country, according to our law, we cannot strip someone's citizenship. So that is not. So only time the citizenship can be stripped if he or she becomes the citizen of another country. But for UK and USA and some other country, this exception is made that they cannot be stripped of their citizenship unless and until they are 24. So I think Shamima Begum does not need to apply. She is automatically a citizen. Just she needed to apply for the passport at the Bangladesh embassy. So this is first thing. So I think that the lawyers of Shamima Begum or her parents did not want to get her back to the Bangladesh as much they wanted to get her back to Britain. So this is my personal opinion. And my second opinion is why this.
I think we'll stop there because we have so many people asking questions. Is that all right? And
Yeah.
There was one more. We were going to let T. Bagavora had a good question. Zach, you want to let Bagavora ask?
My name is Tarana. We spoke. I'm from the OSCE.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember. Sorry.
Several times. Yes. Shall I repeat my question, or you got?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
So I was wondering if journalists and legal practitioners looked at this issue of children, especially lured by ISIL, to travel to ISIL protected controlled territories at that time from the trafficking perspective, because for the trafficking convention, it's immaterial if the person is forced to deceive, if it's the child. So if the child is transferred and exploited, that already qualifies the case as a child trafficking. So I was wondering if that's been looked at by journalists or investigated in that sense, or by the legal practitioners, especially in Shamima's case also. I would be interested to learn the opinion.
Thank you. Okay, so Anthony, do you want to start, and then Tasneem?
Certainly. I'll start with Peter Galbraith's questions first, but in reverse order. Resources for the Kurds. So last autumn, I was in northeastern Syria during the Turkish attack there, and one particular case stuck in my mind. I went to this hospital. There was this young guy been terribly injured in an airstrike, Turkish airstrike, Kurdish fighter blown up in a Turkish airstrike. And I said to him, which area of the line did it happen on? And he'd been in a bunker somewhere. And I said, how long had you been an infantryman with the SDF? And he said, only a couple of weeks. I was actually trained by the Americans as a prison guard to look after foreign fighters in Hasaka. And I'm like, oh, did the Americans teach you how to fight? And he said, yeah, they taught me a bit of unarmed combat. We weren't armed in the prison wing. So the Americans taught me unarmed combat. But as soon as the Turks had attacked, he had just been deployed to the front line and then blown up by a Turkish airstrike. So it struck me as sort of the irony of so much of that situation, that here was a young guy who had been taught unarmed combat to look after, prisoners, including American citizens who are ISIS fighters as well, and Brits, taught unarmed combat, and yet a NATO power attacks the area of our allies, and he gets blown up by an airstrike. There is some money, and I don't know how much and in what sums, given by the French, the Americans, and I believe the Brits, to Kurdish authorities in northeastern Syria to help maintain the prisons of including which have ISIS foreign fighters, males in them. I don't know how that pertains to, or if it does, our whole and Al Roj. But as I say, and as I said at the beginning, the Kurds carry huge load and responsibility and having to look after people that they didn't want in their country, that are, to some extent, our security services, when it comes to the foreign fighters, particularly let through our airports to go and attack Kurds in northeastern Syria, and now won't have back. So sums of money, I don't know, nor quite how it's allocated. It goes on to some extent. As for the speed of the process of rehabilitation, and you might be better placed for Tasneem to answer that. I mean, countries just have such different policies on the repatriation of wives and children.
Go ahead, Tasneem.
Yeah, so I'll look at the repatriation issue first. I mean, if you look at the UK, we have a contradictory approach, partly as you highlighted with the 400 sort of male fighters, an approach that's in private, an approach that's, I guess, tailored to the tabloid headline individuals who come up. So there's that approach too. But there was also the issue of 3 orphan children who Quentin Somerville did a report on, whose parents had been killed in Baghouz, and they were in a refugee camp, and that their plight became headline news some considerable time after Shamima Begum. But the UK government, Ben Wallace having said that he wouldn't risk officials' lives to go and save Shamima's child when he was at risk, the British government did go and send officials and brought those 3 orphan kids back, and they were successfully repatriated with their extended family in the UK, in London, and the news is they're doing very well, thank God. But the UK government was able to do that very quickly, within a matter of 2 weeks, and have those people back on the ground and re-established with their family. So it's completely illogical as to why one position is taken with a baby, and a few months down the line, a completely different position is taken with some children by the very self-same government and the self-same cabinet. The only reason why there's a difference, it appears, is in terms to tabloid news, really. There was a vitriolic response to Shamima Begum, and so the government then took a vitriolic position towards that. Whereas with these 3 orphan children, there was a sympathetic response by the newspapers generally, and so the government took a sympathetic view. Now, that suggests that the UK government is actually controlled by tabloid editors, really, and that's a very, very worrying position, something that ought to be folded in, no doubt, to the next sort of case around it. But with respect to the issue of trafficking, that's a very interesting point by Bagovita. It's one that we've raised. I wrote a letter. It's a 36-page letter to Sharjah Javed. It's been published in the Times as well, and it does stipulate. You're absolutely right. As far as the law is concerned in the UK, Shamima Begum was the victim of trafficking, and she has protections that are owed to her by that. And the international treaties that we've adopted, well, we've transposed those into UK law, not very well in fairness, but actually the UK legislature has taken a wider view on the issue of trafficking than our own domestic legislation, and is actually implementing the international treaty over and above the domestic interpretation of that treaty. But that is all being done in the context of human trafficking in criminal gangs, and also on the issue of county lines, the drug dealing and use of children around drug dealing. That hasn't yet transposed over to a situation like this, although legally, of course, there should be no bar to that. And that will no doubt be argued in due course. But as I say, I was so sickened by the approach that rather than waiting for these arguments to be deployed in the eventuality of time in court proceedings, I thought that they ought to have been in the newspaper, so that anyone, it's not just, there are a few law firms who deal with this type of issue, but any law firm who comes across this should have a template of legal arguments out there that they can access very quickly in order to deal with a similar issue should it come across their desk. And I think part of this issue that the ambassador also raised about the responsibility of states and what the SDF are doing about trying to help people come back, and how they're looking after us, the resources they're spending on the people that they're looking after. It is dishonorable, frankly, how Western states have been shirking their responsibility and offloading them onto the people who are the actual enemy of the people that they're looking after. So these ISIS fighters have been fighting the SDF and the Kurdish people, and those people are the only ones, it seems, who have been shouldering the responsibility of looking after these people as decently as they can. Now, the conditions in those camps are bad, but frankly, if you walk around outside Al Raj camp and you look at how the locals live, or some of the locals live, it's not dissimilar to the conditions of the people in the camps themselves, really. So the Kurds of that region are expending more resources towards the upkeep and look after of their prisoners than actually they've been doing to their own people around that area. And that is a deeply honourable thing for any group of people to be doing. And they're not a state; they're rebels, really. So, given our sort of moral position, seems to be that we, being the fifth biggest economy in the world, are incapable of doing something that a ragtag rebel group are doing for their own enemies, and they have no duty to them. They are not citizens of Kurdistan or the SDF or Syria or anything. They're our citizens, really, and it's a cause of great upset. In terms of what they could be doing, well, we've seen what Turkey has done, really, where Turkey as a state wishes to try and get some advantage from the West, then they have 3 million Syrian refugees in their country. They've agreed to hold them, and therefore close their borders to them to the West. But whenever the Western states near to them are not playing ball with Turkey, Turkey simply opens the border and says, let a few go through, and guess what? You've got an existential problem on your border, and we're the ones that are protecting you from that existential problem. Now, I don't think the Kurds will do that, but it may well be that the Kurdish ability, or the SDF's ability to resource these camps, completely collapses at some point. So whether we like it or not, these people, and what these people will be in the number of months to come, will almost certainly hemorrhage from that position and become everyone else's problem anyway, in some after some function of time. I hope that's addressed.
Yeah, that's great. So we have more questions, but I just want to jump in and say some people are commenting about separating mothers from children. And I can say, when I wrote my letter on behalf of Shamima Begum's baby, I said, if you take a psychologist's point of view, which I'm a psychologist, it's never a good idea to separate a young baby from its mother. You disrupt the attachment process, and it's confusing for both of them. And if you're going to reunite them at any point, it's going to be tough. So psychologically, you want to keep them together. But if legal and moral issues make you want to jail the mother and save the child, okay. If the mother is agreeing, then you have to get the other entities involved to agree with it. So there's legal and psychological issues, of course. And then there's, as many questioners and commenters have said, there's many psychological issues. Shamima Begum left when she was 15. Normally we treat underage specially according to the law. Jack Letts left when he was 19, but he had a history, which is documented, of OCD. So do our laws take that into consideration? Normally they do. Kimberly Pullman from Canada had a history of rape. She was watching a case of her rapist being tried and falling apart and feeling suicidal while someone was telling her, come to Syria. At least as a nurse, you can help the small children. And, imagine if you're reduced to your choice of suicide or going to act as a nurse somewhere and thinking you're doing something heroic that you hopefully will return from and maybe be in better shape. Of course, it didn't work out that way. But normally the law does take into account the psychological and emotional health of the person and their status as a minor. So Tasneem can speak much more on that. But I want to continue to go to the questions and comments. Vladimir, I'm not even going to try to say your last name right now, Vladimir, because I don't have it in front of me. But he's been living out in Erbil and going in and out of Syria, living in Syria some of the time, and is very knowledgeable about the issues there. He's raised some questions on chat and made some comments. So Vladimir will open it to you for a few minutes.
Yeah, I also interviewed, by the way, the husband of Shamima Begum. We haven't talked about him a lot. He's Dutch. He's a convert actually to what I also found interesting about him, that he didn't seem to be so radical. He seemed to be quite sort of unhappy with ISIS, and he was denying that he did any active combat, although the Kurds were saying it was a little bit weird because he got injured in Kobani. So it was also interesting that her husband actually almost didn't get much attention, although Shamima Begum got a lot of attention. And what actually my question was about, is there, to the lawyer, if there's any cases of non-orphan children, ISIS children that were taken back to their countries, because so far I haven't only seen orphans. And recently I think France took back one sick orphan child who was very sick, and France took back the child. But in general, there have been, I think, almost no cases, because the Kurds also, they say they don't want to take away the children from their mothers. So that's a interesting point. For the rest, also what Anthony Lloyd was saying, that it's true that the US is giving financial support to the SDF to take care of the prisoners. And also they have been providing medicine and also anti-riot gear to the SDF, and recently also some pepper spray and other stuff. So the US is paying even for the prisons in the past, but I think recently the thing that changed after the Turkish invasion, that they don't have any more sort of US special forces monitoring the prisons. There's not so much an active presence anymore of the US military in the prisons. That was in the recent Pentagon Watchdog report. So yeah, we can go back to the answers.
Thank you. And thank you, Vladimir. I knew you'd have knowledgeable things to say. And there are cases of women that have given up their children, and Peter's going to speak about that in detail on the 24th, but maybe Tasneem, you have something to say about it as well?
Yeah, under international treaties and the rights of children, it's not, a state cannot take a child away from their mother, really. It's a child's right to have their mother with them. The mother can voluntarily give that up, but I mean, it's up to the mother if they do or they don't. In the UK, I'm not aware of any cases like that. What we did say on behalf of Shamima Begum's family was that the family would be willing to take on board the responsibility of the child even without Shamima Begum being there, and we understood that Shamima was most concerned about the welfare of her child, and we were hoping that she would have been able, if we could have communicated with her, to actually volunteer that. But we simply weren't given the opportunity. The child very sadly died before any of that could have been taken forward. And one of the reasons why the UK government was not very eager to take on children and leave their parents behind is because that child would then have rights, and it would feed into the rights of their parents to come back to the UK. You see, it would bolster their ability to challenge a citizenship stripping position, because it would activate family law rights, which are protected by the European Convention of Human Rights. So, but effectively, it's something that the governments have not been at all willing to do, because to bring a child over is effectively to give a lifeline to the parents to come over as well.
And I'd like to jump in on that and say the first case that I got involved in before I went into SDF territory was Samantha Al-Hassani. She's an American that had 2 kids that had passports, born in America, and 2 that were born in Raqqa. And I got involved in her case through her sister when I was asked to advocate on behalf of them. So I went to the American ambassador, Doug Zilliman, who's a friend and who I respect very much, and also to her representatives from her state. But the way that the whole issue was framed was more like a divorce case. So we have Americans that one spouse will take their child overseas or maybe back to their country of origin, and there'll be complaints at the embassy, do something. And we don't typically interfere. It's the right of a parent to take their child. So this is what I was hearing from the embassy. But I argued back, in any case in US jurisdiction, if we saw a mother or a father putting their child in front of ISIS videos, much less joining ISIS, we would sever, at least temporarily, parental rights. And when the Justice Department got involved in this case, they agreed with me, because what I said was, we have a duty to go and get those kids. We sent the Marines to try to rescue James Foley. Unfortunately, James was not rescued, so sadly. But we did send the Special Forces to do that, the SEALs, I meant to say. And why wouldn't we send a soldier who's driving by Camp Rouge to pick up those kids? So these all get into thorny issues where countries haven't thought it through yet, how to respond to parents that take their children overseas to a terrorist group. Tasneem, you want to say something else?
Yeah, so when Shamima Begum, well, we knew she was pregnant, and we had an entire strategy about this issue, and if her child had survived, and it's an important question. So given that you have a mother who's taken her child or has a child in ISIS territory, by definition, that's a mother that maybe their parental responsibility ought to be removed, as you say, temporarily. In the UK, that would mean that, and we had this on the side waiting, was that the grandmother was going to make an application to become the child's responsible guardian, and therefore bring that to court as a family law proceedings, and then would have standing to require the British government to then bring her child as the guardian back. The interesting part about that is that where you have a guardianship case in the UK, then the mother or the parent has an absolute right to appeal that decision. Now, that would mean that if the grandmother was able to bring those proceedings, and she would have been, then Shamima Begum would have had the right to come back to the UK to appeal that decision, whether she wins or loses. The problem is that entire strategy then collapsed upon the death of the child. But different jurisdictions are going to have different interesting eddies in the law that allow for arguments to be placed which benefit the parents of the child one way or the other. There is no international convention around that, so it's each state has its own laws.
That's so interesting. Anthony, I wonder if you would also comment on the psychology. Shamima was so vilified for the things that she said to you and that you reported in your article. And for me, when I read it, I understood that that was going to be the reaction. But I also, I guess as a psychologist, you learn to desensitize yourself to things. So, when you deal with rape victims, the first couple stories you hear are horrific and you have nightmares. But after a while, you can listen to hundreds of rape stories. I've gotten to the point where I can listen to beheadings and torture and everything else. So probably you, the same as a war correspondent, have desensitized yourself to a certain degree to things that other people wouldn't be able to tolerate. Can you comment on how you saw Shamima in that regard, talking about, yeah, I saw severed heads and not seeming too bothered by it?
I've seen severed heads too. It depends what kind of day you catch me when I talk about it, but I can sometimes say it bothers me and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, if one lives in a very violent world, I've been doing this for 26, 27 years now. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But I think there's a bigger question now, which is slightly the role of journalists in that. I didn't find anything she said particularly horrific. She said she'd seen one severed head in a bin and it didn't faze her. I wasn't gonna have the willies over that, right? Mm-hmm. I challenged her on the issue of journalists because I knew half the journalists who were beheaded by ISIS. So I found it offensive that a woman could sit in front of me knowing I was a journalist and say they were probably spies. People have said to me, I can see some of the questions, you know, would I have done anything differently? I think that question, first of all, goes to Shamima Begum. Sure, she was 15 when she's left, but let's just talk about that time frame. She left after James Foley has been beheaded, and a video of that has been shown. She leaves after Stephen Soloff has been beheaded, after Peter Castig's been beheaded, after David Haynes has been beheaded, all on video, after Alan Henning has been beheaded. She leaves after we know that the Caliphate have killed thousands of Syrians and Iraqis and Kurds. She leaves, and then in a very short space of time as well, talking about how emotion doesn't just apply to people in prison or in war, but to us too as society and in politics. In a very short space of time, after she leaves, we have the Paris attacks, we have the Nice attack, we have a series of London Bridge attacks, we have the Manchester bombing. So we shouldn't be naive in anticipating that our society, European societies, aren't going to be extremely angry that society has changed. What was running through her head to watch those videos and go out and still think, yeah, I'm going to join Islamic State, or I'm going to live, a slightly different question, I'm going to live within the Caliphate. So people say to me, and I see some of the questions now, oh, you know, would you have done anything differently? No, I wouldn't have done anything differently. I tell you exactly how, what that first story, for those of you who read it, and that first radio interview did, which was quite a difficult thing to do, was encapsulate everything that she had said. The weird sort of contradiction of some of her statements. What I would, and I've met, you know, scores and scores of Islamic radicals across the years, and from Chechnya to Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria. To my mind, I absolutely thought she was radicalized. Point number one. To encapsulate within that story also her vulnerability, the fact that she seemed to have independent will and criticize Islamic State, and her youth, and her pregnancy, and the fact she had just lost 2 kids and was clearly worried about losing a third. And I did that in a straight back fashion under the headline, Bring Me Home. You know, I gave her the best shot I could in that story. But, you know, no one listening in should confuse me with someone who's sympathetic to volunteers who go to Islamic State. She voluntarily went to Islamic State. Let's be clear about that. She might have been 15, but she's a pretty smart kid. And she sat down and looked me in the face and said, I knew the implications it could have on my citizenship, right? So let's get that straight down the line first. The bigger question, does trial by public opinion, how does that affect the politics and legality of it? Well, that's a very big question. It looks to me that it was a populist decision. It was a decision of political opportunism that was made. And it was a more mature political decision would have been to wait and at least digest what she was saying, what had been said, and actually find out a bit more. I mean, no one actually came and spoke to me about it at all afterwards. You'd think actually someone from, I don't know, the security services or even the Home Office might have actually said, hey, kind of what state was she in, and what else, and what do you think? No one said anything. It's just like, right, take her citizenship. And so I just want to say that in terms of emotional climate, you know, it was a different emotional climate when Shamima Begum was found to the emotional climate in which she left in 2015. There's a series of egregious terrorist attacks had happened, which had altered people's emotion and mindset a lot. And that was just on the back footer of the murder of journalists by Islamic State, all of which she would have been clearly aware of.
That's all really great, Anthony. Thank you. And you've addressed a lot of the questions that were in the queue. I wanted to say something about that, and it's just escaping me, but it will come back. Jessica Ewert had a question. Do you want to ask your question, Jessica? Are you still here?
Hi. Yes, I am. Anthony already sort of answered the question, but I raised a question of if people generally felt that the publication of Shamima Begum's story and the negative reaction the public had towards it, if that heavily influenced how the government then handled her situation. If there hadn't been a moral panic, if there
Uh-oh, we're losing. Jessica,
connected?
yeah, I think you're freezing up, but it's okay. We got your question.
Okay,
Oh, and I just wanted to say, I've talked to so many people that the question is exactly what Anthony brought up of, you know, didn't you watch these beheading videos? Didn't you see the news? But when I watch what's happening in my own country right now under Trump with his fake news, and the people that watch Fox News and the people that watch the other news are getting completely different realities. So why should we expect that people that are following ISIS, thinking that they're a good caliphate in the beginning because they started out portraying themselves that way, and the champion of the Syrian Sunni Muslims who were being downtrodden by Assad, who did far more atrocities than ISIS ever did, why wouldn't they, if they're on their unique channels and being told everything else is fake news, be the same as what we're seeing in the American population and in the UK population, this division of where do you get your news from? And
and just to step in there, a lot of
Yeah.
Islamic State have no problem with people having their heads cut off without when their hands are tied behind their back.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
not that they think
that's true.
it's not that people look and think that's fake news. People look and say, yeah, I'm quite happy joining an organization which done that. I just want to make that point very, very clear.
Yes,
I think people watching atrocity videos, beheading videos, do not think they're being lied to. Many of them think that's fine. And there's often a recruiting spike for Islamic State when these videos are released, which fulfills one of the aims of the videos. But Jessica's comment to do with how did moral panic affected it, that's a really good question. It's not like I walk down the street and think, yeah, I did, really did a great job in informing the British public with a positive result. I mean, the first part of that question, yeah, I absolutely fulfilled, the role of my job, which was to inform, and I think inform in a nuanced and detailed way. What was the result of that? Well, it was a cataclysmic sort of rage storm, which was there was no ability to digest the detail of her case, the nuance, the complexity, the fact even she had been a legal minor when she'd left home, all that was lost. So does moral panic, have a weighted effect on law and on politics? Yes, it seems so.
And that never helps if you are brown-skinned. Sometimes if you're a woman, the rage can be stronger, or sometimes it's less, but certainly she triggered a lot of things.
Just to finish really quickly, as a journalist on that case, it was very interesting. The times when newspaper run comments online. So the comments under the story I wrote there was just a brutish and savage. I compared it with some comments I noticed in a Daily Mail story pertaining to two white Austrian girls who had gone off and joined Islamic State. I think it was around the same time, 2015, and all the comments, and this was Daily Mail readers as well, quite a right-wing paper, were all like, oh, what a tragedy, and so sad they made that decision, and all the rest of it. And I couldn't help but compare the two sets of comments, the brutishness of the public reaction towards Shamima Begum's case, and the totally different reaction to that of white female converts who had gone over to join the caliphate.
Yeah, so I thought I'd jump in on that. The interesting thing about those two Austrian girls, one of them was bludgeoned to death in 2016 and was the reason why Khadija Sultana didn't come back to the UK when she attempted to, was one of the Austrian girls that tried to come out was caught by ISIS and bludgeoned to death publicly. But I think the Daily Mail reporters, commentators would have had a slightly different take if they actually realized the two girls were originally Bosnian and were actually Austrian by naturalization, basically. They weren't converts, but that would be your average Daily Mail report reader not going into the detail. In terms of where the feeling is around this, Anthony did his job as a journalist with an absolutely straight bat. Didn't make my job any easier at all, but I have absolutely no issue with a journalist reporting on the news in a straight fashion, which is exactly what Anthony did. The problem that we have isn't that, and it's a misunderstanding that people think we're talking about sympathy, but we're not talking about sympathy. We're talking about the rule of law being applied appropriately to people who may or may not have committed some wrongdoing. And the appropriate law there is the criminal law. If the UK say that Shamima Begum's broken or her ilk of people have broken the law, then take them to a court of law, bring evidence against them, and have them tried by a jury of their peers, not find some tricky artifice in order to take their citizenship away so that A, they are not examined, no evidence is brought against them, really, and that the public themselves, we, the public, are denied the right to see what wrongdoing they actually did and how they got to where they got to. You know, we had multiple failings in the UK, a multiple notice around Shamima Begum and her at least two friends that the UK police were actively investigating, and yet 3 15 and a 16-year-old girl managed to get out from under the noses of counterterrorism police, cross 2 international borders, the UK and Turkey, and successfully join a proscribed organization. Now, you know, this is the if you look at that aspect of it, this is the scene of a Monty Python sketch, really, when it comes to policing. You know, how could you possibly have allowed that to happen right under your noses? But it isn't sympathy. It's about what is the appropriate arena to have this behavior examined and punished if necessary. And we've been denied that.
Those are really good points. Anthony, do you have anything else to say at the end? Because we're getting close to the end here. And I'm sorry we haven't addressed everyone's questions, but I think all of us have been reading them and trying to.
No, I thought Tasneem encapsulated everything very articulately and very fairly there. It's not about sympathy. It's not, I've never campaigned for Shamima Begum, but what I would say, and I've said right from the beginning, right from the start, this is a very complex case involving a very young woman. And we deserve for our own society, it's as much, the whole story is about as much as what we are and what our society is in its ability to investigate and, if necessary, try one of our own people. This was a young woman who's born in Britain, raised in Britain, went to a British school. She went to Bethnal Green Academy. No, she's British. Now you can argue about that in some little semantic of the law, but I mean, commonsensically, she's totally one of us. She's a London girl. That's what this story is about. It's about us and our ability to process things through the filter of a credible body of law.
Thank you, Anthony. And it's also about our children. And if we're the countries that we want to be and proud to be part of, then we should protect all of our children. And there just cannot be any argument if you go from, I would say, age 10, but put it down to 7 or even 5. Those kids didn't choose to be part of ISIS. They're not dangerous. You know, a 5-year-old is not going to suicide bomb you. And anybody can grow up to be a terrorist, as we have seen. So, you know, you're just that your parents were in it doesn't make you a terrorist. But, and I also want to say in the end that I've interviewed one woman from the Netherlands who said, when I asked her, you joined so late, didn't you see this news about ISIS? And she said, I don't believe any of that news. I'm Muslim, I'm Moroccan. Why would I believe that? The news is very Islamophobic. Lisa Smith, I asked her about the news. And she said, well, I was seeing that news, but then my mentor that was telling me to come and that I had an obligation to come was saying, no, it's not true. I'm in Raqqa, we're having ice cream. And so she believed the person she knew more than the outside world reporting to her. I heard that also from a Tunisian who said, ISIS told me don't believe anything you hear about us, it's all fake. And you know, we know this claim of fake news works, otherwise my president wouldn't be using it. But thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you for your brave reporting. Stay safe. Don't let anything happen to you when you start traveling again. And we all so value your reporting. We wouldn't know what's happening on the front lines if it wasn't for people like you. I'll say the same to Vladimir if he's still on. And thank you for Tasneem for reminding us that we do live under rule of law and that it's not about emotions. It's about everyone has a right to be judged by the law, brought to justice. And thank you for fighting for that and fighting for our democratic freedoms. Please join us on June 10th when we'll be asking people that are on the front lines in the prisons in Europe that are working on rehabilitating and reintegrating people that have been in terrorist groups and served their time in prison under terrorist charges, some of them from ISIS. And they're going to be talking about their success stories and what the elements are about whether a terrorist can be rehabilitated and if we need to be so afraid. And certainly there's people, like Anthony pointed out, that enjoy violence, and we need to be afraid of them and we need to control them. On the 24th, we'll have Ambassador Peter Galbraith, and he's got a lot to say about his work in SDF territory, and one particular case that I think he really acted as a hero, helping to repatriate children. I don't want to tell too much about it because I want him to tell. So thank you all for joining us, and I think it was a lively discussion. All the comments, we're copying them, and we'll figure out a way to just taking part.
Thank you.